Hello and welcome to episode 52 of Question and Answer. I am your host, as usual, Masa. And I think it's been like 3 weeks since I've done one of these, and it was kind of predictable why I went for 3 weeks. Sort of, kind of, was after 2 weeks, I only had about 18 questions. And that was probably because in the Q&A video I did before this, I was not exactly getting overwhelmed, but I was getting so many questions, it was taking well over 2 answers to answer all of them. 2 hours to answer all of them. And so I requested that people limit the number of questions per Q&A to 6. It was 5 plus an extra bonus question you can ask. So it's 6. It's 6 for the price of 5. And it was kind of predictable that people would think, oh, he's complaining about people asking questions. And so I just got way fewer questions than usual after that. So maybe I shouldn't have said anything. But then last weekend, I was just going to do a nice, easy 18 question Q&A. And I was just so busy doing other things that it just didn't happen. So now we're back up to about at least 30 questions. And I could make these short by answering concisely without meandering and digressing everywhere, but nope, not going to do that. So I suppose, without any further ado, I'll just go to the first question here. And this is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, I heard that Venerable Sariputta was fanning the Buddha at the time, and this is, he's referring to the Discourse to Diganaka, the Diganaka Sutta. So I'll just do a little commentary and then start the question over again. So I did a video discussing the Diganaka Sutta, and according to this sutta, it was this discourse that the Buddha delivered to an ascetic named Diganaka that caused Sariputta, who was fanning the Buddha at the time, to become enlightened. When he heard this discourse, there was just something clicked. Sariputta became enlightened. This was back when Sariputta had been a disciple of the Buddha for, I think, just like maybe 2 weeks. So I'll begin at the beginning of the question again. I heard that Venerable Sariputta was fanning the Buddha at the time. What kind of fans did they have in ancient Magadha back then? On top of that, where would the Buddha sit when giving these kinds of talks to people? Did he sit cross-legged on the ground or on some kind of elevation, as is customary today of many Indian spiritual teachers? What are some other cultural means of respect that were given to the Buddha like these that you can think of? So I guess that's like 3 questions, but we'll just start with the first one, which is reasonable. So what kind of fans did they have in ancient Magadha? I'm pretty sure that fans in those days were mainly made out of palmyra leaves, as a lot of them are still made today in Burma. You got, it's not like the long frond like a coconut palm. It's like the fan of a palmyra that's, it's, big and it's kind of spiky, and then you just cut off the spikes and you put like a border, like a reinforcing border on it. And you can use just the stalk of the leaf as the handle, or you can add like some fancier kind of handle. And I assume that's mainly what people like monks were using in India for well over 2,000 years. So I assume it was probably that kind of fan. And it's cheap, palmyra leaves fall, and you just pick one up and trim it a little bit, and you can use it as a fan. So let's see, on top of that, where would the Buddha sit when giving these kinds of talks to people? Did he sit cross-legged on the ground or on some kind of elevation, as is customary today of many Indian spiritual teachers? Well, considering that he was wandering around a lot, I assume that a lot of the time, at least, he was just sitting on a mat on the floor or on the ground, under a tree somewhere. It may be that he was sitting on like a slight eminence, maybe the highest ground in the area, because there was a certain etiquette, and we'll get to that in the next part of this question, a certain etiquette with regard to paying respect to a teacher and also paying respect to the Dhamma, or to Dharma in general. And so there's actually a rule of monastic discipline forbidding a monk from teaching Dhamma if he's sitting on a lower seat than at least one of the people that he's teaching. So it's just a sign of respect that the teacher sits on, if not a higher seat, at least an even seat. He doesn't sit on a lower seat. It may be if he was in a monastery that he would sit maybe on a bench or something. I can't remember what the Indian word is for those wooden platforms that teachers sit on, but a lot of the time he's just sitting on the ground. And let's see here. What are some other cultural means of respect that were given to the Buddha like these that you can think of? Well, it wasn't just means of respect given to the Buddha. It was means of respect in ancient India given to any spiritual teacher. And for example, you don't point your feet at a venerable person. There's a rule of monastic discipline against drinking alcohol, in fact, where there was a relatively highly advanced monk. I don't remember if he was an arahant or not, but he was a highly advanced monk who, for some reason, drank alcohol before it was against the rules. He didn't drink it to get drunk. It may have been medicinal or something. And he just fell asleep with his feet pointing straight towards the Buddha. And that was a sign of, look how drunk and careless he is. He's pointing his feet at the Buddha. So you don't point your feet. I mean, you don't sit with your feet out in front of you, when you're listening to a Dhamma talk. There's also a rule of Dhamma, a rule of Vinaya, that you don't teach Dhamma to someone who's sitting with his knees up, hugging his knees. And you don't teach Dhamma to someone who's carrying a weapon. You don't teach Dhamma to someone whose head is covered. They should uncover their head. You're not allowed to teach Dhamma to someone who is wearing shoes. That it's a sign of respect that you take your shoes off in the presence of a spiritual teacher. There's also a rule of discipline that if a monk is approaching a senior monk, if the senior monk is barefoot, then the approaching junior monk has to take his shoes off before he comes close to the elder monk. There's just various ways. You make Anjali, it's called. Let's see, other cultural means of respect that were given to the Buddha, like these that you can think of. Yeah, I think that's a lot of the main ones. You bow or at least put your hands together. Don't wear shoes. Don't point your feet. Don't sit in disrespectful ways. Don't have like a weapon or anything on your person. Don't have your head covered. I knew this one monk long ago. He was extremely strict. And also he was just extremely ascetic. He was like a Buddhist Rambo. And one time when he happened to be in America, somebody asked him if he would be willing to give a talk to their group, their meditation group. So he sits in front of the group and doesn't say anything for about 5 minutes and then just gets up and walks out. So then the teacher of the main teacher of the group, the leader of the group, runs after him and asks him, why didn't you teach anything? Why did you just sit there in silence and get up and leave? And he said, there was a person in the group who was wearing a hat because it was like winter time and it was cold. Somebody had like a stocking cap on. And he says, it's against Vinaya for me to teach anybody who's got their head covered. And so the leader of the group went back and asked the person to take their stocking cap off or their beanie or whatever it's called nowadays. And then he went back and taught Dhamma. So there's a lot of etiquette things like that. If you're really interested, one of the best sources of information on that would be the Sakya rules, which are towards the end of the Patimokkha rules. So I'll just move on to the next question from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And first I'm going to drink some bovine glandular secretions with the umbrella to show that I have class. Okay. So, Siovaksh Sipad Zidana says, how do you reconcile the idea of consciousness being like electrons that are always there and only manifesting itself in certain ways due to the brain changing it, but the Buddha is saying that consciousness does not arise without a cause? First of all, the comparison with electricity, the consciousness, what he's talking about here is I've compared the brain to a computer, and that the computer doesn't create electricity. It just takes the electricity and complexifies it and organizes it and utilizes it. And I was saying the same thing about the brain. It doesn't create consciousness. It just complexifies consciousness that's already there and organizes it and utilizes it. So he's saying, how can I compare consciousness with electrons when the Buddha says consciousness does not arise without a cause? So I wouldn't really compare consciousness with electrons so much as I'd compare consciousness with like the quantum field, how empty space contains infinite energy. But it's not really measurable except in certain obscure ways. Physicists, there's like the Casimir effect or things like this where you can deduce that empty space contains infinite energy or zero energy, just depending on how you do the math. The math comes out right either way. But the Buddha says that consciousness does not arise without a cause. That's sort of this vijnana khandha. I mean, consciousness that is discernible, that you can perceive as consciousness, would arise with a cause. That infinite formless consciousness is the same as nothing, essentially. Everything and nothing, infinite energy and zero energy in the quantum field. It's sort of that paradoxical sort of situation. But with regard to vijnana khandha, the aggregate of consciousness that is one of the constituents of a human being, then you can say, sure, that kind of consciousness does not arise without some mental state. I mean, you have to be conscious of something. You can't just have plain consciousness. There always has to be consciousness of something. But if you get into infinite formless consciousness, then it's all bets are off. You just have this paradoxical state where anything that's infinite and formless, I mean, it has no beginning, no end, no boundaries. You can't perceive it. In order to perceive it, you got to have some kind of limits to it, some kind of boundaries, some kind of discernible characteristics. And the theory goes, the argument goes, that infinite formless consciousness, sort of like the Upanishads are talking about as Brahman and Atman, Tattvam-asi, that it's like an absolute. It's not samsaric. It's just off the scale. Once something starts being infinite and formless, when it stops having a beginning and an end and boundaries and so forth, it's just off the scale. It's not really in samsara anymore. So it's a paradoxical situation. And that's just the way it has to be. If you're discussing the absolute, it's going to be paradoxical, unless you just have really rudimentary ideas about the absolute. And any kind of idea about the absolute is going to be like invalid, if not just plain false. It's going to be at best invalid, because any kind of concept or explanation is inevitably going to be samsaric. And you can't discuss something that isn't samsaric using samsaric terminology. You just drag it into samsara and just sort of mundanify it into something that isn't the absolute anymore. So I think I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipadzirna's next question. It's weird. It's like I always want to drink something when I do these videos. I know I just feel more comfortable doing it. But then it makes me have like these little burpy things that my sweetheart is always kind of getting on my case about. So why you keep doing that on the videos? So just because. So anyway, Siovaksh and Sipadzirna says, in the Parayana Vagga, Buddha says to see all things as empty. And in Nagarjuna's breakdown, he says the idea of emptiness is inherently linked to dependent origination, as nothing has its own independent existence. However, Nibbana is also called empty, but if it is outside of dependent, then why is it considered empty? It seems like it would be the one thing that isn't empty because it isn't dependent on anything. Can you please explain why emptiness would apply even to Nibbana? Well, Nibbana is indeterminate. I mean, it's like reality is empty. So, like, phenomenal things ultimately in reality are empty. Nibbana also in reality is empty because reality is, I mean, you can call it empty, which is kind of, again, you're having to use samsaric terminology. You can call it abhyakata, indeterminate. I mean, you just can't pin it down. And that's just the way reality is. Anything at the ultimate level, at the level of paramata satcha or ultimate truth, is going to be fundamentally empty. Unless you're an Abhidhamma scholar, then maybe you might have a different idea. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Crazy Librarian. And Crazy Librarian is asking a question with reference to a statement I made on the Discord server. See, there was in the past, the recent past, on my Discord server, there have been some Pure Land Buddhists who are trying to portray Pure Land Buddhism as authentic teachings of the Buddha, and I just cannot buy it at all. In some ways, Pure Land is teaching the exact opposite of what the historical Buddha was teaching according to the earliest texts. And so I made this statement, and this is a quote from what I wrote on the Discord server. 2 things I say about early Buddhism and about what the founder of our spiritual system taught. 1, no mythological Buddhas, including Metta, Kassapa, and Dipankara, let alone Amitabha. And 2, strive to get enlightened in this very life. So then Crazy Librarian asks, with reference to that statement that I made, what does this mean? Isn't Metta, Dipankara, and Kassapa in the Pali Canon? Well, yeah, Metta, Dipankara, and Kassapa are mentioned in the Pali Canon, but they're not mentioned in the earliest text. Just because something is in the Pali Canon does not mean that the Buddha himself actually taught it, that it goes all the way back to the earliest teachings. I mean, there are some Pali texts, some texts that are canonical in the Pali Canon, in the Tipitaka, that weren't composed until literally hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. And so Metta, Dipankara, and Kassapa eventually, in my opinion, I mean, this isn't orthodox, pretty obviously, but in my opinion, it was, the cult of the Buddhas, where the Buddha became mythologized. He wasn't just an enlightened founder of Dhamma, of the system of Buddhism, that he was just one of a long line of Buddhas that when Dhamma disappears from this world, then a new Buddha has to rediscover it, and he has to be much more advanced than any of his disciples. He's not just an arahant. He spends countless eons perfecting his paramis, and paramis literally means like perfection, and there's 10 of them in Theravada Buddhism. And he's got to purify his character just over countless eons in order to become a Buddha, in order to set the wheel of Dhamma rolling again after it finally dies out due to impermanence. And everything that has a beginning has an end. And so eventually the Theravada Buddhists just came up with this, essentially like a pantheon, or this lineage going back countless world cycles. They've got them all named out. I mean, going back just countless eons, just countless worlds before this world. Countless Indias before, the present India. And Dipankara was the Buddha that was the Buddha of a world just, a zillion gajillion years ago. And he was the one that gave the Vyadate. In Burmese, it's called Vyadate. You can't become a Buddha unless another Buddha prophesies that you will become a Buddha in the future. That kind of sets you firmly on the path of becoming a Buddha. So our historical Buddha, Gautama Buddha, was he was a non-Buddhist hermit or ascetic. And Sumedho, that was his name, Sumedho, like Ajahn Sumedho. And there's this story about how Dipankara Buddha was going to come to a ceremony where he and his millions of followers. I mean, I don't know, I don't remember how many, but especially in the past, legends of past Buddhas, the numbers just become astronomical. Like with regard to their height, with regard to their lifespan, with regard to the number of followers, the number of enlightened followers, with the number of like just like the intensity of their austerities and so forth. They just become just off the scale in just mythological exaggeration. And any of you who really want to learn about this, just look up Mangala Buddha. Look up the details of Mangala Buddha, who was a few Buddhas after Dipankara, I think, in some previous world where there was an India where people were speaking Pali and so forth. So anyway, Sumedho, he volunteered to prepare a certain amount of footpath for Dipankara Buddha and his retinue of enlightened monks to walk to get to the pavilion where they were, all of them were going to be fed. It was just, a city-sized pavilion, presumably. And he didn't have time to finish. There was this one muddy spot. So he just throws himself on his face on the muddy spot so that the Buddha and his retinue can walk over the top of him. And then Dipankara Buddha prophesies. I guess it's kind of a Judeo-Christian word, but he predicts or foresees that this Sumedho, this hermit Sumedho, is going to become, in countless eons in the future, a Buddha named Gautama. So it's largely mythological. Maitreya is going to be the next. In Sanskrit, it's Maitreya. Kassapa was the Buddha directly preceding our historical Buddha Gautama. So, I really don't think that the Buddha was teaching about other Buddhas. In fact, the whole idea of the Buddha being like way above, like a whole different order of enlightened being above his enlightened disciples, I really do think that's a later development of just glorification of the founder. And then from glorification of the founder, it just branched off into all this mythological stuff, eventually culminating in like the Pure Land idea of these other cosmic Buddhas like Amitabha and Medicine Buddha and so forth. So just because something is in the Pali Canon does not mean that it's necessarily true. And there's lots and lots of fairy tales, talking animals, fire-breathing dragons, and mythological Buddhas that you can find there. But don't believe everything you read. So we'll just move on to Crazy Librarian's next question. And he says, I assume Crazy Librarian is a guy. Regarding your answer, I assumed his gender. Regarding your answer where a monk has to choose between caring for a sick loved one and his duty as a monk, did the Buddha ever talk about this in the sutta and give advice what to do? Well, in the suttas, they're pretty hard-nosed. It's like to practice Dhamma is the most important thing you can do. It really takes precedence even over supporting your family. And the one story that really stands out in my mind, and some of these stories in their glorification of the monk's life at the expense of like worldly duties, like filial duties and so forth. It can sound really awful to a modern Westerner. And this story sounds pretty awful. But anyway, there was this monk who was ordained, and he had been married and had a child, like a baby, sort of like the Buddha had a baby when he went forth and became an ascetic, according to the legend. So there's this monk who is, he left his wife and his infant baby. I guess all babies are infants, aren't they? So he left his baby, and he's a monk now, and he's meditating in bliss, presumably, at this park. And so the wife catches wind that her ex-husband, the monk, is in this park. So she brings the baby, and she just comes up to him and gives some little speech like, here's your child, you take care of him. And she just sets the baby down in front of the monk and walks off. But being curious and all, she like hides behind a tree and watches to see what this monk's going to do. And the monk doesn't do anything. He just keeps meditating. He just ignores the baby. And he just keeps ignoring and ignoring the baby. He's like in deep meditation or some such. And finally, the ex-wife, the mother, realizes that he's not going to do a damn thing with that baby. So she just comes back and picks him up and walks off with him and manages to take care of him somehow. And in a way, the Buddha's own story, according to the legend, he does something similar. I mean, he didn't really leave his wife and infant son in any state of hardship because, according to the legend, they were living in a palace. So, I mean, they weren't going to starve or anything. But, I mean, if you can reconcile practicing intensive Dhamma and, taking care of like an aged parent with dementia or something, then, I mean, that's fine. And some monks can manage that. But according to just the hard-nosed ancient Indian approach, in that Dharma is the most important thing that you can dedicate your life to, then yeah, it takes precedence. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from the person who used to have an easily pronounceable name, but now it's like, he explained it to me at least once, how to explain the name. But it's Trizao's, something like that. So Trizao's says, I am willing to take one for the team. What was your scariest experience in Burma? Well, I should have read up on this. I should have reviewed. I did write about this shortly after it happened, within just a few years of it happening. But it's been well over 10 years now. But I mean, it's kind of a long story actually. I was living at this monastery, Wanbo Wildlife Refuge Monastery, Wanbo Bemet Dojian, and with one other monk, and he was in his late 70s, early 80s. I'm not sure exactly how old he was, but he was bitten by a cobra and died. So, like, I think it was the next day, we cremated him because it was the hot season. We don't have electricity. Meat goes bad in hot weather. We had to cremate him fast. So we cremated him. The day that he was cremated, I was going to go to the outhouse to attend the call of nature. I opened the door and there's this big Russell's viper. I mean, deadly poisonous snake, the most dangerous snake in Burma, is coiled up right around the water pot, right in my outhouse. And so naturally, I just changed my mind about taking a dump just then and just kind of slowly backed off and closed the door and left it there. But none of this was the scary part. I mean, you get used to seeing snakes. Old Unandia being bitten by a cobra and dying. I mean, it wasn't really scary. I mean, it was definitely sobering, I mean, it was definitely something to take very seriously, but it wasn't really scary. But what was scary was I think it was like 1 or 2 days after the cremation. And this is like April. This is like the middle of the hot season, just blazing hot. And I'm inside my cave doing walking meditation, just walking back and forth. And I happen to notice that outside, through the air hole, like the window, everything starts turning brown. And so it's just kind of weird. I hadn't seen that before. So I look out there, and it's like I'm looking through brown tinted sunglasses. Everything is brown. And the wind just starts blowing really hard. And then all of a sudden, I mean, it's like 110, 115 degrees Fahrenheit outside. These big hailstones, like the size of strawberries, just start whipping down. And they're kind of like at an angle like this. The wind is blowing so hard. And within like 15, 20 seconds, the ground is covered with ice. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? I remember reading a long time ago a science fiction story called Lucifer's Hammer by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle about what happens when a comet smacks into the ocean. And this sort of thing does happen every few tens of millions of years at the very least. And so there's this guy, a scientist, he's walking down the street in California somewhere, and it's a bright sunny day. All of a sudden, the sky just blackens and it just starts pouring down rain, just in torrential downpour. And some of it gets into his mouth, and he tastes that it's salty. And it's like when he tastes salt water is pouring down, he knows something seriously is going wrong. And that's kind of the way I felt. It was like, the middle of the tropical hot season. It's just semi-desert, and everything just turns brown. You've got intense winds, and just all within 20 seconds, the ground is covered with ice, just these big balls of ice the size of strawberries. And I'm thinking, man, what did nukes hit or something? Yeah, really, I thought it was like World War III had just started. Because I couldn't, I mean, it's like I wasn't sure, I didn't just jump to conclusions, but it's like, what the hell is going on? And so it was like this feeling of like alarm and dread, much worse than like, almost stepping on a viper or something. It was just this really visceral kind of just, is the world coming to an end kind of a feeling. So that's kind of a long answer to a short question. So I'll just move on to Chirzawa's next question here. You sitting next to the waterfall and Athena's sigil comment about imagining you living there and contemplating like the Buddha gave me the idea for the next question. Okay, this is due to some video I made next to a waterfall not too long ago. And Athena's sigil left a comment on the YouTube video saying that he imagined me just living there next to the waterfall, contemplating the immensity of the universe or whatever. So, Chirzawa says, do you think that people have different mind state when dwelling in nature as opposed to city and urban areas? They may be calmer or more peaceful or something. Yeah, well, definitely. That's why monks are encouraged to go out into the forest, or at least in the Buddhist time, monks were encouraged to go out alone into a forest and just meditate at the root of a tree. And I've mentioned this before, but one of my favorite suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya is the Lesser Discourse on Voidness or Emptiness. And step one, if you want to cultivate emptiness, is you go out into a forest, because there's less commotion going on, less crying babies and barking dogs and just people yelling and talking and creaky cartwheels going down the tracks and just artificial rules that you have to follow, artificial like right angles and straight lines that just don't exist in nature kind of a thing. So it's like your first step towards emptiness and just like peace, freedom, liberation, is you get out of town. So yeah, you naturally tend to be calmer or more peaceful if you're in a forest, unless you're just scared of bears or something. So I'll just move on to Chirzag's next question here. How is it to work after 30 years of leisure? Was it hard to get used to it again after all these years? That's kind of an interesting question. But the thing is, I mean, if you're living the life of a monk seriously, you're living conscientiously as a monk. You're not doing it entirely wrong. I won't say that I was doing it entirely right, but there was a lot of right in there, and it prepares you for anything. It prepares you for death. It prepares you for life-threatening situations. It prepares you for just about anything. I mean, you're more equipped to deal with whatever comes up if you practice Dhamma intensively. So, it wasn't really hard to start working again, except physically. Just being on my feet, 8 hours a day, and just lifting, heavy bundles of like sheet metal stuff. Yeah, I mean, that was the hard part. I was just wiped out my first month. After, being a member of the leisure class, I did do some exercise. I did kind of a lot of walking when I was in Burma, and there's, chop wood, carry water kind of stuff, but it wasn't like hard work for 8 hours a day. So mainly it was physical, but the mental aspect of it was actually pretty easy. I adjusted fairly easily. So we'll just move on to the next question. I think this is from Justin K or Just Inc. Only Inc. Or it's Justin K. Yeah, take your pick. So Justin K or Just Inc. says, would you ever do a top 10 book recommendation video on your favorite books pertaining to Buddhism or just in general? I'd love to hear books relating on the forest tradition. I've actually done book recommendations, and my old blog used to have, I'm pretty sure, the top 10 most important books that I've ever read. But the old blog isn't up anymore. It has been abolished. At least I've done everything I know how to abolish it. So, yeah, Justin says, I'd love to hear books relating to the forest tradition, but I'm not sure that very many of my top 10 most important books with regard to understanding Dhamma or understanding reality or even understanding the world would have much to do with the forest tradition, unless you're just talking about very ancient forest tradition. Like the Sutta Nipata would probably be in my top 10. And I mean, that's like the original forest tradition. That's when all monks were forest monks. So, I mean, that was very inspiring to me. It was reading the Sutta Nipata that pretty much inspired me to become a Theravada Buddhist. Because, I mean, it's people nowadays, they think about Buddhism as, it's like soft and feminine and wimpy. And I think I've been told, I don't know if this is true, but most Theravada Buddhist teachers in the West, like Vipassana teachers, Theravada so-called, are women with a high percentage of like lesbians. But I mean, that's not the way it used to be. Theravada Buddhism, in like as it originally existed, was one of the most masculine spiritual systems ever devised, because it was devised by ascetic men who were just tough as wood and who avoided women like the plague. So, yeah, that would be about the only books in my top 10 relating to the forest tradition would just be like the Sutta Nipata, just really ancient stuff. I mean, I won't try to come up with the top 10 off the top of my head, but I mean, like the first really important book, like the first real paradigm changer that I ever read was Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape, which I read when I was like 14 years old. Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, which I read when I was like 18, would probably be on the list. It's what I consider to be a really important book. It's a book that like significantly changes the way you look at things. And another one is Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, which was a book written back in the 1950s, early 50s, talking about, I mean, it's really fascinating how he's talking about how we're all governed by habit. Not only humans, but dogs, higher vertebrates. We just have these habits that we follow, and they don't necessarily make us happy, but so long as they seem to be getting us through the world alive, we just cling to them and don't want to change, unless we hit some kind of crisis in which the habits aren't working anymore. And then we have like a breakdown. And then we become very, very open to suggestion and change. And that's how like Chinese brainwashing worked. That's how a lot of interrogation methods, like especially in Stalinist Soviet Union, worked. It's how like military basic training worked. It's how like Stone Age, like manhood rituals used to work, where you have this kid, you send him out into the forest or make him undergo this harrowing ordeal, so that, I mean, he's just in this state of crisis, and then you turn him into a fearless warrior who will not question commands from the chief or whatever. And a lot of spiritual stuff, like some meditation retreats, or some of the early Christian kind of, not really early, like Methodism started in this way with John Wesley would give these sermons, and he generally avoided sophisticated city slickers. He went out into the rustic areas where people were more simple and they had less capacity for skeptical doubt about the Bible. This was like back in like the 1700s. And his sermons were mainly divided into two parts. The first half of the sermon is he's telling them, if you don't repent your sins, you're going to go to hell. And any Christian, any believing Christian would have to believe that. And then the second half of the sermon, he is just going into gory detail on the torments of hell with the demons and the pitchforks and the boiling tar and all that kind of stuff. And people would just freak out because they couldn't deny it. It's like he's just pounding away at this idea. If you don't change, if you aren't born again, you're going to burn in hell forever and ever. And they couldn't really deny it because they were Christians. And people would just be foaming at the mouth, going into convulsions, just totally freaking out, becoming unconscious. And then when they'd finally regain consciousness, they were born again. And then they'd have like teachers or trainers who would be like kind of giving them the suggestions they needed to hear to restructure them into good Christians. So, I mean, that was an interesting book for me, but I don't think Justin K was really, yeah. I think he says he'd love to hear books relating to the forest tradition. Yeah, I mean, the only book relating to the forest tradition that would be in my top 10 would be probably the Sutta Nipata. Although with regard to understanding Buddhism, I've got back here is Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey. I've mentioned that many times in my videos. I mean, that has some mention of forest-dwelling monks because it's going back to the origins of Buddhism. He's trying to explain what the earliest Buddhism was like. And of course, the earliest Buddhism was forest monks. So yeah, I mean, maybe I can do it again. But I have discussed the most important books in my life a number of times. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. Let's see here. Justin says, also, what are the differences between the Burmese, Thai, and Sri Lankan forest traditions? Well, the only forest tradition that I know a significant amount of information about would be Burmese. I might know more about the Thai forest tradition than the Burmese forest tradition because the Thais have more of a forest tradition than the Burmese do. I've never been to Sri Lanka. I've met relatively few Sri Lankan monks. I've read a little bit about Sri Lanka. I know that they have like a new forest tradition. There's like a reform movement trying to go back to the early spirit of Buddhism. And that's good. I mean, I've heard nothing but good about this new Sri Lankan forest tradition. But I really don't know that much about it, other than that it appears to be very serious with monks sincerely trying to live up to the early ideals of forest-dwelling bhikkhus. In Thailand, there's much more of a tradition of forest monks, largely because of Ajahn Mun. Ajahn Chah, I suppose, was a forest monk. There are a number of Thai forest monks, and there's a Thai forest tradition. A lot of Pra Tudong, which are monks that practice Dhutangas or like the optional ascetic practices, where they just wander around and they sleep under trees. They might cheat just a little bit and have what's called a krot or a clot, which is a big umbrella with a mosquito net that you can hang from a branch so that you're not getting bitten by mosquitoes. But still, it's relatively strict. It's not as strong on meditation. The Thais seem not to be as strong in meditation as the Burmese, but with regard to monastic discipline and asceticism, they outdo the Burmese. But with regard to the Thai or the forest tradition in Burma, I was ordained in the Tongpulu forest tradition, which was one of the only well-known forest traditions in Burma. And it was mostly composed of like simple village people. I mean, you're out in the forest, so most of your recruits into this tradition are going to be, from rural villages, agricultural communities, because, that's where they're the ones that are closest to the monks. They're more likely to see the monks. They're the ones that are offering alms to the monks in the morning. And so, I mean, there wasn't a lot of scholarship in the Burmese forest tradition, at least, and in the Tampulu tradition, you get a few really intelligent ones who are attracted to it, who would enter it, and then they generally move off and become famous, living outside of a forest or in some little patch, little grove or something. But I like Mahamyan Uzodika or Ujodika, not the famous Ujodika of the Shui Umin tradition, but Ujodika or Zodika of the Tampulu tradition. So, I mean, all in all, the Burmese, they have a really high opinion of Abhidhamma. They know the scriptures really well. They're really into scholarship. The Thais maybe don't know the suttas as well on average. There are fewer scholar monks in Thailand, but there are more strictly practicing ascetic monks. Even though Burma probably has a more solid meditation tradition. And in Sri Lanka, in the forest tradition, like I say, I mean, they tend to be knowledgeable, intelligent monks. They know the suttas. They probably don't have much use for Abhidhamma. The Thais also generally don't talk about it much. And what their meditation and their monastic discipline is like, I really don't know. So that's my little bit of knowledge on comparing the three forest traditions. And I suppose you could also throw in like Laos and Cambodia and so forth, but they really don't have a strong monastic tradition there. Partly because in Cambodia, of course, most of the monks were killed off by the Khmer Rouge. So we'll just move on to the next question here, also by Justin or Justin K or Justink. Honorable Panyo Basa, I've been watching your Q&As for quite a while now. Thank you for the time you take in answering our questions. Why, thank you, and you're welcome. I read a few years ago about a story of a famous forest monk, I think from the Sri Lankan tradition, who was approached by a rich woman who wanted to show off her piety. The monk was known for his disdain towards the laity and responded to the woman by showing his ass. Is this disdain for the laity common for certain monks? It would make sense given that traditional Buddhism has a spiritual hierarchy. Did you see laity as not gonna make it, as compared to the monks who are striving to break samsara? Well, my own teacher, my main teacher as a monk, Venerable Tampulu Chaltsin Doya Seattle, he did, I mean, because he was Burmese, he was culturally conditioned. He was a product of his culture. So he just naturally assumed that monks are superior to lay people. And in Burma, you don't even use the word for human being for monks. I mean, Lu is the word for human being. You don't use it for monks. You're counting. In Burma is a peculiar language because there are these counting words that you have to use. Like if you're naming a number of something, like the word for counting people is yaut. So you don't say 3 people, you say people 3 yaut. Lu thon yaut. And monks just aren't counted with yaut. Monks are counted with ba, which is used for counting anything exalted or noble or holy, like Aryatissa Leba is the Four Noble Truths. So, it's just built into the culture that monks are considered to be superior to lay people, at least more venerable, more holy, I suppose. I wasn't so much a product of that culture, so I didn't have that idea nearly so much, especially when you look at the way most of the monks are. Most Asian monks really are not striving for enlightenment. And my my observation was, in a lot of places at least, the lay people were better Buddhists than the monks were. Really, neither of them had much likelihood of becoming enlightened in this life, but at least the lay people were taking 5 precepts seriously, whereas the monks have more than 2,000 precepts, and they just pretty much ignore most of them, except for the superficial ones about having your head shaved and wearing the robes properly and so forth. They might take that seriously, but I mean, most of them handle money, and they just weren't serious. So, um, a monk showing his bare ass to a woman, that would actually be against linear rules, I'm pretty sure. Showing your privates to a woman is certainly against the rules. Um, Showing your ass, maybe if she couldn't see the privates, um, but still, I mean, it's obviously an act of contempt. I mean, maybe he was some kind of eccentric holy fool saint type, and he did not have any kind of derogatory volitions or anything. So maybe, I mean, my teacher, who I started off talking about, I didn't get to the main point, is like, he would not accept anything from a lay woman or a lay person who is wearing shoes. I mentioned earlier that you show respect by taking your shoes off before you approach a holy man. If somebody forgot to kick off their sandals before offering him food, he'd tell them to take their shoes off. And women had to have what's called the Tibet, not the country, but it's like this little like a towel or a scarf that lay women wear over one shoulder, and it doesn't really have any purpose other than just traditional, but it's a way of showing respect, I suppose. And he would not accept alms or anything from a woman that didn't have like the little scarf or towel over one shoulder. They'd have to go get one if they wanted to put some food in his bowl or something. Also, I'm kind of reminded of I'm kind of surprised that nobody has ever asked in these Q&As who the little guy sitting next to the Buddha is up on top of the altar there. And that's he was a famous alchemist, kind of a sage in like medieval Burma back in the days of the Burmese kings. And I'm pretty sure his name was Bobo Ong. And one of the most famous stories about Bobo Ong is a woman came to him and she asked for his blessing because she was starting a new business, or she already had this business. She wanted him to bless her so that she would be successful in business. And he pulled out his dick and just slapped her upside the head with it. And apparently it worked because she prospered after that. But I mean, whether that was contempt or not, it's hard to say. I mean, you can't really know with certainty what the karma is of an act performed by somebody unless you know what their volition was, why they were doing it, what mental states they had while they were doing it. So let's see. I hope I answered this question. Let's see. Approached by a rich woman and wanted to show off her piety. The monk was known for his disdain towards the lady. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can, like a wise monk or a wise teacher can do stuff to kind of humble, proud, arrogant rich people. Like Neem Karoli Baba, whose picture is also up there on the altar. He would do that with rich people too. I mean, like rich people, they'd give him all this really fancy food. They want to feed him this deluxe meal. And they'd be advising him, here, eat this first, and then after that, cleanse your palate with this, and then try some of this. And then he'd just stir it all together into a glop before he would eat it. But if a poor person offered him food, he'd act like it was like this kingly feast, So he wasn't like doing it out of, any kind of desire to humiliate in a bad way the rich people, but sometimes, people, they're just all puffed up with pride, and, a wise person can use skillful means to kind of deflate them a little bit. But I don't know exactly what the motives were for the monk showing his ass to the rich woman. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Francois, alias Francois. And Francois says, a couple of years ago, there was a debate in the form of an exchange of small publications between Ajahn Thanissaro and Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thanissaro describes anatta as a skillful means that should be used to get rid of egotistical views and not so much an ontological statement on the fundamental nature of a self. While Bhikkhu Bodhi sees anatta mainly as an ontological statement, I tend to favor Thanissaro's interpretation. Actually, I mean, I'm kind of sorry to say it, but I do tend to go with Bhikkhu Bodhi on that one. that Ajahn Thanissaro, I mean, he does have an ego, and he does kind of wallow in it a little bit, or it seems to me, in at least in the past. Maybe he's moved beyond that at this point. But no self, really. I mean, I'd be more inclined to go along with the Mahayanist, like Majjhimaka interpretation, in that there is no self because there is no distinctions. There is no distinction. There is no this as opposed to that. Even to distinguish this from that is papancha, and enlightenment, nibbana. One of the synonyms for nibbana is nipapancha, or no papancha. No discrimination, no distinguishing this from that, not even shit from shinola. So, yeah, I mean, I would have to go with Bhikkhu Bodhi, even though his politics, in my opinion, are unworthy of a bhikkhu. But still, I mean, it's not just skillful means. There really is a self. You're supposed to just deny it. I mean, what would be the point of that? That would be practically dishonest. If there is a self, but you're just not supposed to say there is, just for the sake of helping you to defeat your own egoism. Ajahn Thanissaro, I'm sure, would explain it differently from that, but that's kind of the way it strikes me, just reading this. I mean, there just is no self, because there is no this or that. It's like, it's all like mental. It's all the way perception works. It's like the way perception works is first you have to single out something, and then you slap a label on it. It's namarupa or papancha sankha, where first you have to single out something. You have to give it borders. You have to differentiate figure from ground. And then you give some sort of significance or meaning to that. Even if it's a, what the hell is that? Still, it's a that. And that is all artificial. You can't differentiate figure from ground even. You can't differentiate anything without relations. Same as, different from, bigger than, smaller than. These are relations. And without these relations, you don't have like a multiplistic world. You don't have plurality. The only way you have plurality, more than even one thing, maybe even one is too high of a number, is you have to differentiate things. And you can't differentiate things without relations. At least different from. And different from does not exist out there in some external world. I mean, like a chemist can take a sample of matter and he can analyze it. He can divide it up into its constituent elements. He's not going to isolate any pure different from. It's just not there. It's all in your head. And that is largely how I interpret anatta. So unfortunately, I guess, I have to agree with Bhikkhu Bodhi on that one. So I'll just move on to Francois' next question here. Hi again, Monsieur Pugno. People don't call me Monsieur very much. It's just M dot, but I assume that's French for Mr., which is Monsieur. I have a question. I listened to a lot of your videos, and it seems to me that you adopt the Majjhimaka view of emptiness, i.e. a kind of quasi-mystical substance or principle, some kind of universal panacea or ultimate reality. My interpretation of the early Buddhist or Theravada notion of no self is that there are actual entities, all impermanent, of course, all of them an assembly of impermanent aggregates, all of them existing only in conditionality with other factors, i.e. existing only in a conventional sense. For me, the point of anatta is that for all those reasons, I can't own this entity I call myself. So there is a conventional entity, but even in this conventional world, this entity is not a self. I think the Buddha saw that the main problem with the self is the ownership notion, which is fundamental in any definition of a self. So there is a self, but it's not mine. That's kind of like Ajahn Thanissaro, because a self implies having control over it and enjoying it, which is ultimately impossible. Thus, the three characteristics, dukkha, anicca, anatta. With all due respect, I don't really like the interpretation of emptiness as the fundamental nature of everything. It seems to me like an unconscious reification. The Buddha was talking about emptiness as a tool, not as a principle that one should use only sporadically, like a purgative. He said it is like a boat to cross the river. Once the river is crossed, you don't carry the boat with you. Did I understand correctly your interpretation of anatta? Cheers. Um, I don't think that Francois here understands the Majamaka position that he's saying here. My interpretation of, let's see, a quasi-mystical substance. The emptiness is a kind of quasi-mystical substance or principle, some kind of universal panacea or ultimate reality. I mean, he's not going far enough. I mean, if he was to say that to Nagarjuna, Nagarjuna would just shoot it down. It's like, nope, that's not it. Because with regard to any statement you can make, the correct answer is invalid. Nope, that's not it. To say that it exists is invalid. To say that it doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it does and doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it neither does nor doesn't exist is invalid. Any kind of statement you make is going to be samsaric and conditioned. It's not going to apply to what is not samsaric and not conditioned. So, I mean, you can refer to a quasi-mystical substance or principle, all you're doing is reifying what cannot be reified, or intellectualizing, trying to turn it into a concept that is still validly applicable to what is out there or even within. And it just doesn't work that way. Like Majamaka, it shoots down all arguments and then saves its own arguments for last and then shoots those down. Because no argument you can make is ultimately valid. It doesn't apply to reality. So, his interpretation of early Buddhist or Theravada notion of no self, there are actual entities. Yeah, I mean, I already went over that in the question above, the previous question, that you cannot have entities without adding this purely artificial mental perception. You take away perception, the entities don't exist anymore. And then you can say, well, they exist out there. We're just identifying them. All you're doing is you're just trying to kick perception out the front door and sneak it in through the back again. Because you cannot have multiplicity without perception. And the perception is not it. That's not reality. That's just symbols. Purely artificial. So, let's see here. And again, he seems to be saying that there is a self, it's just not myself. But that's not what anatta says. Anatta says there is no self. Sabbe Dhamma anatta, which means all Dhammas are not self. And it's not even sankhara. It's let's see. Sabbe sankhara dukkha. Sabbe sankhara anicca. All conditioned things are dukkha. All conditioned things are impermanent. But they don't say sabbe sankhara anatta. They say sabbe dhamma anatta because they're even including unconditioned stuff. You know, it's not just all conditioned things are without self. It's everything, including nibbana. It's just there is no self in ultimate reality. And to the extent that you want there to be a self, in a way, it's kind of craving to exist, clinging to existence, or craving for existence, or just being stuck in intellectuality, being stuck in perception. If you have a really good mystical experience, maybe you can get some feel for it. You can grok that really there's nobody there, whether you identify with it or not. So let's see here. Yeah, the main problem in the self is the ownership notion. Yeah, I do think that Nagarjuna came about as close to any post-Buddha Buddhist philosopher with regard to understanding dependent co-arising and emptiness and so forth, that he says dependent co-arising is emptiness. That because, I mean, there is no fundamental underlying essence to any discrete entity. And so these discrete entities are reliant upon context and just perceptual processes and so forth. And the context and the perceptual processes are all just part of the same mutually artificially generating system. But it's really hard to talk about this kind of thing. So let's see, he doesn't like the interpretation of emptiness as the fundamental nature of everything. Well, forget emptiness, just call it abhyakada. It's indeterminate. You cannot pin it down. You cannot understand it intellectually, no matter how hard you try. It's sort of like Kant wrote some critique of science. I don't remember the title of the book, where he's saying that no amount of scientific progress is going to bring scientists 1 inch, 1 micron closer to knowing ultimate reality, because you cannot know the highest truth intellectually. It's just not going to happen. So let's see here. Buddha was talking about emptiness as a tool, not as a principle. Yeah, I mean, again, that's just kind of dishonest. If there really is a self, but you're saying there isn't, but the Buddha's saying there isn't one, I mean, he's speaking untruths. But maybe you can say, well, he's just kind of using it as a kind of, I mean, it's not entirely dishonest. He has honest intentions of getting us enlightened or something. And let's see, he said it's like a boat across the river. I mean, that's Dhamma, that's the practice. That's all the stuff you're doing. It's the practice is like the raft made of rubbish that you cross the flood with. And then once you get to the other side, you don't need it anymore. You don't need anything anymore. So I guess the end here is, did I understand correctly your interpretation of anatta? Not exactly. I don't think. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, people around me are pressuring me to spend most of my time in worldly pursuits, but I want to spend more time practicing the Dhamma. Any idea on how I should deal with this? Yeah, just do what you think is right. And if everyone around you thinks you're wrong and a fool or whatever, then that's just too bad. I mean, that's one reason why Western monks tend to be more serious about their Dhamma practice than Asian monks from a Buddhist culture, is because a Western monk, he might have to go against his family, lose all of his friends, just go against his culture in order to follow Dhamma. And so he's more serious about it. He's not doing it just to follow along with the herd. He's not following along with his cultural conditioning. He's dead set on cultivating wisdom and purity and so forth, trying to become liberated. Whereas a lot of Asian monks, they're really just there because, they're too ugly and lazy to get married and work for a living. A lot of them, and you'd be surprised. Not all of them, of course, not even most of them. But most of them really are not trying very hard at all. They're just going for merit to get a better rebirth or something. So, any idea how you should deal with it? I mean, you just got to stand up for your principles. You got to do what you know is right. If you do what you consider to be wrong just because you cave to pressure, even from your own parents, then, I mean, you're doing yourself a serious disservice. You have to follow your own conscience. So, I mean, it may be that you'll get disowned by your family and lose all of your friends, but it's more important to do what you consider to be right and to practice Dhamma as intensively as you can manage than to just cave and, relinquish your spine and just go along with what they want you to do. I mean, if I did what my parents wanted me to do, man, I'd have grandkids by now probably. So I think I'll just move on to Nirmit's next question. Did the Buddha ever crack jokes? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I mean, there are no suttas where the Buddha is obviously doing some kind of stand-up routine. There is some humor in the text, but it tends to be pretty dry. there's one sutta, I think it's in the Samyutta, that in CAF Reese Davids's translation, she calls it Little Ugly, the sutta on Little Ugly. And it's about some demon that it's sort of like, there's been like an episode of the old Star Trek that was like this, where you've got this entity that's like feeding on negativity. And the more negative people are around, and this entity becomes more glorious and beautiful and powerful and so forth. But if people just start having positive mental states, then it kind of shrivels up and becomes dark and ugly and weak again. And I think in Reese Davids, in one of her comments, she says that the master is in a humorous vein because it's told in kind of a funny way. There is that one verse of the Dhammapada where you can, each term in the verse has like a dark side. So it goes like, the man who is, faithless, a burglar, who destroys opportunities and eats vomit, he truly is the highest of men. Something like that. And I mean, you can call that humor, I guess. I mean, why else would somebody deliberately make this verse of the Dhammapada? I mean, it's not necessarily going back to the Buddha. The Dhammapada is not particularly old document. But I mean, why would somebody deliberately make a verse where, each one of the key words has like an alternate, like an alter ego, this alternative meaning that's like completely negative, eating vomit and so forth. So I mean, there is kind of some humor, but it's very dry, very, very, what's the word, deadpan. So yeah, the Buddha, I don't think he really cracked jokes, and even like laughing, an arahant doesn't laugh according to tradition. I mean, the most he might do is smile a little bit, probably even a tight-lipped smile, not showing his teeth. So, yeah, cracking jokes is considered like vulgar. It's sort of like what lay people do. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Avenity. And Avenity says, could you tell some stories about witches and other Burmese myths and legends? Well, I actually did an entire video about like supernaturalism or paranormality in my life, where I had a number of witch stories in that one. My father, as I've mentioned before, was kind of warlock, a trainer of witches, the leader of a coven. So, I mean, I have some secondhand stories from him. I didn't actually participate in any of his witchcraft stuff. Burmese myths and legends. Yeah, I've given lots of examples. I'm trying to think of like some story that I haven't already told. With Burmese myths and legends. There's one book, Burmese Supernaturalism, by Melford Spiro, who's like a cultural anthropologist. He lived in Burma back in the 60s, I think. He has all kinds of weird stories about, like, there's a saying in Burma, it's like a proverb that 1 in every 7 houses houses a witch, that really they think there's witches everywhere. And I've been warned about witches so many times. And there was a couple of stories about how witches can detach their heads, and then the head will just be rolling around, just kind of moving around just by rolling, and they eat excrement and so forth. But I'm trying to come up with a good. I mean, I've already told the story about how I was supposedly attacked by magical ogres. It's kind of a long story. I think that would be included in the paranormality in my life video that I uploaded maybe a month or so ago. Let's see, witches. I'm to some degree, I still am a little superstitious about, like, it's known that, at least among some people, that if a witch gets a hold of like your hair or your fingernail clippings or something, they can do spells against you. And I've always been kind of careful about, like throwing away my fingernail clippings, You just take them outside. I don't like throwing them in the garbage either for some reason. I just take them outside and like toss them under a bush or something. But Burmese myths and legends, there's lots and lots of them. Way more myths and legends of the traditional type than you'll find in a Western country. Um, there's one kind of I don't know if you call it a myth or a legend, but there was a Burmese. He was sort of like the Burmese Samson or like Hercules. He was like this super powerful man in Burmese legend who, like Samson, lost his power if he got his hair cut. But this man, he lost his power by walking under a clothesline with women's sarongs hanging on it. And that just deprived him of his mojo or whatever it was. And to this day, the Burmese are real. I mean, they do not walk under a clothesline with women's clothes hanging on it, partly because of this legend, I think. I remember one time, I mean, as a Westerner, I didn't give a damn. I didn't care. I didn't know. I just walked under this clothesline that had like women's clothing hanging on it. And there was a monk there who just completely freaked out. He just thought, it was like, I had just, walked naked through town or something. It was just unthinkable to him that anyone would do that. And so when I was coming back the other way, he was like standing there blocking my route and like waving me around, don't do it again. Um, there's one story, I don't know if I've told this one recently anyway, but I was a junior monk living in Amarapura. And every morning I would walk across this rickety old teak bridge called Upain Bridge, Upain Dada. And there was a village on the other side, Tauntaman village. And I'd go for alms in Tauntaman village and then walk back across this rickety old teak bridge. And one day I was walking for alms there, and up ahead I saw this young woman with like a rolled up bamboo mat in one arm and a baby in the other arm. And when I get there, she spreads out the mat, puts the baby on the mat, and then asks me if I will step over the baby. And I was just learning Burmese at the time. I hadn't been in Burma for very long, and I'm like, let me get this straight. You want me to step over the baby? And she was like nodding real vigorously. She really was keen on the idea. And so I went, okay. So I stepped over the baby, and since I was on the other side of the baby, after stepping over it, I stepped over it again to get back on the side of the road. And she was real happy about that. And then she ran down to this little booth and bought me some toothpaste and stuff and offered that out of gratitude for me stepping over the baby. And apparently the Burmese believe that like a holy man, who she considered me to be one, if a holy man is like moves over the top of somebody, it drives out evil spirits and so forth. So apparently she thought that I was driving evil spirits out of her baby, or maybe it was just like a prophylaxis, just making sure that the baby didn't have any malevolent, forces or beings or entities or anything. I did that more than once, stepping over babies. But yeah, most of my stories like that, the paranormality in my life video, I give quite a lot of stories like that of just paranormal events and just stories about paranormal events, seeing apparitions and being warned about witches and dragons and ogres and so forth. There's lots of them in Burma. At least people believe that there are lots of them in Burma. So I'm sorry I couldn't come up with a really juicy one that I haven't already told yet. I mean, I'm sure they're in here in my head somewhere. And if I come up with any more, I'll try and share them. But I think I'll just move on to the next question here, which is from Edelweiss Voyager. And Edelweiss says, hello, Panyo. I was wondering if you incorporate prostrations into your practice at all. Personally, I find prostrating and apologizing to the gods for my weakness to be spiritually healing. Yeah, I've never really been very like idolatrous or worshipy. I have bowed to that statue probably many times, but it's not like a regular practice or anything. It's like, there are certain times in my life. Um, to be honest, the most I ever bowed to a statue, like the most intensively and fervently, was I was in Burma, oh, maybe 7, 8 years ago by now, and this may be 2016. And somebody had given me this little vial of liquid LSD, and there was supposed to be just like one dose left in the bottle, but whoever put in more drops than it was supposed to be, and I wound up taking this, like, probably the largest dose of LSD I've ever had. Or oh wait, no, it was the time before that. Time before that. I'm sorry, but anyway, I was high on LSD, and I was just bowing to that Buddha statue over and over again. I was my the place where I was staying was this little room off to the side of the main congregation hall of this monastery. And so it was like this big altar, this shrine, right in the front of the back of the room, in this little alcove. And I was just bowing and bowing and bowing. I was just kind of overflowing with gratitude, you know. But as a general rule, yeah, I've just never been very worshipy or faith oriented. Always been more intellectual and philosophical in my understanding of Dhamma. And mostly I would not bow to statues. I'd be in Burma, and we'd start doing a ceremony. You know, all the monks would come together to recite the Patimokkha or whatever, and all the Burmese monks would bow to the statue, and I would just kind of sit there because, I don't know, maybe, you know, having been a Christian in a previous life, I've got this thing about idolatry or something. Another thing that reminds me, Edelweiss Voyager says here, I find prostrating and apologizing to the gods for my weakness to be spiritually healing. It could be as a result of having been a Christian in a past life. I've been told that I was a Baptist minister in the lifetime immediately preceding this one, who was my own grandfather, incidentally. But it was like a mantra that would come up. It doesn't come up very often anymore, but there was a time in my life when it would come up a lot. And it was just, Dear God, please have mercy upon me. Or, Dear God, please have mercy. I wouldn't say, Dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner. Like, I think it's in the book of Luke, the gospel according to Luke. You've got the tax collector in the back of standing at the back of the temple, beating his breast, and, you know, Dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner. Just, Dear God, please have mercy. You know, it was like this little prayer that would just get repeated like a mantra sometimes, just without me deliberately trying to do it. Like, I do Om spontaneously still, even now. It just comes up spontaneously sometimes, especially if I'm walking or waiting for something, you know, waiting in line or something. But yeah, I do not incorporate prostrations into my practice. It can happen spontaneously, but not very often. It's just not my approach. Different people have different approaches. Some people are more heart-oriented, more faith-oriented. Other people, you know, they're more head-oriented. You know, it's different. I mean, I'm not saying that it's wrong or any such thing, but it's just not the route that I have taken in life. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, and this is from Ketchup. Not catsup, mind you, but ketchup. And he says, Hello, Panyo. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on my poem. And I think the title of the poem is Art of Being, and it's about meditation. And so I'll just recite this poem here. Atoms, space, whole body, Bud in breath, Do out breath, warm and soft, well and happy, smile, all beings, heart raise, awareness, concentration, emptiness, detachment is highest, just being. And then he says, thank you. So it strikes me as inspirational. It strikes me as optimistic, that it's entirely upbeat. You know, there's no dwelling on dukkha or impermanence. I mean, maybe a little bit of impermanence, but it's not anything that's inspiring samvega or spiritual urgency or alarm. It's pretty soft, and, you know, here it is, warm and soft, well and happy. So I suppose if somebody needs some optimism and uplift, this kind of poem would be a good thing. Although in traditional Theravada, there's also like the negative side, the dark side of samsara that really should be paid more attention to. And that's, the inevitability of death. The first noble truth, to exist is to be unhappy, to be dissatisfied. That sort of thing is actually more of a traditional Buddhist theme than the warm and soft, well and happy stuff. Although some people need the warm and soft, well and happy stuff too. So, yeah, I mean, you can derive benefit from reading this kind of thing. I'm reading it again. I don't want to miss anything important. Bud in breath, do out breath. That's a common Thai practice, just using Budo as a kind of a mantra. Smile, all beings, heart raise. Yeah, it's very heartwarming, kind of warm and soft, upbeat, optimistic kind of poem, which in a way makes it not really like traditional Buddhist poetry, because Buddhist poetry is tends to be more kind of, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but facing the dark aspects of samsara, or just scrutinizing samsara and finding it lacking. And in a way, this does this in a positive way, because detachment is highest and so forth. But thank you for sharing. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from NML794. And NML794 says, do you think the Buddha actually claimed to remember all his past lives? That just seems to be a stock phrase repeated in the suttas with no substantiation. The Buddha never talked about his past lives as a hunter-gatherer or an alien with advanced technology. All of the recorded stories, as far as I know, are conveniently set in the Ganges Valley with the Brahminical society of 5th century BC India. Perhaps the early followers invented this idea of past life omniscience in order to deify the Buddha, which would make sense given the later Mahayana tendencies to deify him even further. Well, yeah, early Buddhists did glorify the Buddha. They tried to insist that he was still human, born of a woman and everything, but 27 feet tall and born without any goop on him, and he's walking around talking right after being born and so forth. Yeah, there's obviously some glorification of the Buddha with some mythological elements included even in Theravada. But let's see. Do I think the Buddha actually claimed to remember all his past lives? I don't know. Maybe he did. But I think I'm blurry now. What happened here? Go like this, see if that works. Whoop. It'll fix itself, probably. So, do I think the Buddha actually claimed to remember all his past lives? Maybe he did, but I doubt that he would go into details, especially with regard to having been an alien with tentacles breathing liquid methane. That, I mean, it would just weird people out. They wouldn't get it at all. It would just confuse them. Even talking about foreign cultures, that the people of the Ganges Valley, 500 BC, that they just wouldn't be able to relate to it. And you have to be careful. I mean, the Buddha did say that, the stuff he knew, I mean, he could only share a small amount, because if he told them everything, their minds would just be full of doubt and agitation. So it may be that he just read his audience, so to speak, and told them what he figured they would find acceptable, that they were ready to hear. So it is possible that he did claim to remember all of his past lives, that he was, in a sense, omniscient. But, I mean, how can you really know for sure? I mean, the texts say it, but again, like NML 794 here is saying, it's like everything is always within the context of, the Iron Age Ganges Valley. I mean, you might go into hell. I mean, the Buddha was in hell realms and heaven realms and so forth that technically weren't India, but still it was all in accordance with Indian conceptions of reality and cosmology and so forth. So, let's see. Yeah, I guess I've answered that question. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Naga Kai. And Naga Kai says, is it possible to avoid accumulating bad karma? And it kind of bugs me that I'm blurry. I don't know why. Please stand by. Yeah, still blurry. Still blurry. Technology is wonderful, isn't it? Naga Kai says, is it possible to avoid accumulating bad karma by getting someone else to do the hateful or the harmful action? I.e., if I pay someone to do something that results in bad karma, or just convince them to do it using persuasion, does it go to him instead of me? Well, it goes to both of you. Like, you want to kill somebody, but you don't really want to, you're squeamish about blood or something, so you hire a hitman to kill that person. Well, the hitman is committing the murder, but you are accessory to that murder. Like a monk who who gets a hitman to kill somebody. I mean, if the hitman succeeds in killing the person, the monk is excommunicated for life for being accessory to murder. So, I mean, monks do this kind of stuff all the time, especially monks that are living in a monastery where grass has to be cut, like bushes have to be trimmed along the side of the path to keep the path from getting overgrown, that kind of thing. So they'll say, make this allowable, copy, copy is like the Burmese word for kapia, which means allowable, make it, kapiyam grohi is what you're supposed to say in certain circumstances, which it's sort of like cheating. It's like a loophole in the rules. Like a monk is not allowed to damage plants, green plants. He's not allowed to encourage others or cause others to damage plants. So you just use this cryptic language of make it allowable. And then the monastery attendant or the knowledgeable layperson goes, he wants me to cut the plants. But still, I mean, it's breaking the exact same rule. But that's ecclesiastical rules and not actual karma. It's sort of like the ecclesiastical level of the action rather than the karmic level of the action. But still, I mean, if you want that person dead, for example, I mean, you're already making bad karma. You're talking somebody else into killing them, then you're already making bad karma. It may not be as bad as killing the person yourself, but still, it's not good, and it's not neutral either. You're actually increasing suffering just by your actions, and you know it, and it's motivated by hatred or just ruthless greed or whatever it is. So it goes to both of you if you persuade somebody to do a bad action that you don't want to do yourself. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Austin, and we've been at this for over an hour and a half now. Austin says, did the Buddha meditate without moving for 49 without food or water? I assume he means 49 days. So did the Buddha meditate without moving for 49 days without food or water? And that is a legend that the Buddha sat in meditation for 49 days, sort of digesting his enlightenment experience. And according to Theravada, it was mainly he's going through the 12 nidana theory of dependent co-arising, paticca samuppada. It's like, he's going through it forwards and then backwards and then forwards and backwards and so forth. But he didn't meditate without moving for 49 days because every once in a while, every several days, like every week, he'd get up and move to a different place. He didn't sit under the Bodhi tree that whole time. But I think there's a good chance that this also is a legend and may not be historically accurate. And it's still bothering me that I'm still blurry. If I go like this, I wonder if that helps. Yeah, I should kick it. Yeah, if I go like this, I'm kind of in focus. So, okay. So I think I answered that one. Did the Buddha meditate without moving for 49 days? Even according to tradition, he did move After several days of sitting in one place, he'd get up and sit somewhere else. Um, I'm not sure that it would even be possible to go without water in the tropics for 49 days or subtropics, Bodhi. I'm not exactly sure what the latitude is there. Um, but then again, like very advanced spiritual practitioners can do things that should be impossible for others, like not eating, for example. So, yeah, I'd be skeptical of that personally. But then again, I'm a skeptical Westerner type. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. Could someone with ADHD theoretically become enlightened, or is their brain too distracted to make any meaningful progress? Well, someone with attention deficit something disorder. I don't know what the H is. It's somebody with a very short attention span. Could they theoretically become enlightened? Well, theoretically, certainly they could. Um, I think it may be that if even though your attention is flitting around, if you're still mindful, if it's not, you're not just going completely off the track and becoming unmindful, after 3 seconds. But I mean, you don't have to focus on just one thing like samatha meditation, where you're just focused on one thing. It's like a candle flame or a kasina disc, or just your breath going, your breath, sensation of touch at your nostrils when you're breathing. I mean, you can, so like the Mahasi method or many kinds of vipassana, so-called vipassana, mindfulness meditation, satipatthana. I mean, your attention can be moving all over the place, but so long as you're still mindful, you're still successfully meditating. You're still meditating correctly. Um, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's impossible. I would say it's less likely that you become enlightened. I mean, the more you can calm and silence and clarify and purify the mind, the more likely it is that you're going to become enlightened. But some people need a higher level of clarity and purity than others. So, I mean, some people, they don't need to get advanced jhanic states to become enlightened, apparently. So, you know, a person like that who just has this quickness of mind, so to speak, this kind of a talent that you don't have to get very far before you can make the quantum leap into the absolute, so to speak. So, yeah, I would say someone with ADHD, regardless of what the H stands for, they could still theoretically become enlightened, although the more they could master their own mental processes, or just at least remain mindful while their mind is doing its thing, then the more likely it is that they would become enlightened. So I wouldn't say it's completely impossible, but I would say they'd have statistically a lower chance than someone who is a master of fourth jhana. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question, which is it true that Advaita Vedanta played a role in Buddhism's departure from the Indian subcontinent? Well, I would say that Buddhism's departure from the Indian subcontinent occurred before Advaita Vedanta existed. I mean, if Advaita Vedanta was like the main philosopher of Advaita Vedanta, as far as I know, is Shankara, who lived in like the 5th century CE, which was long after Buddhism left the Indian subcontinent. Um, Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka Buddhism, or Advaita Vedanta and certain schools of Mahayana Buddhism, definitely were interacting with each other through like debates, monks debating each other and sort of borrowing ideas from each other and so forth. But I think that was long after Buddhism had already moved into Central Asia. Like Ashoka, who was really not that long after the time of the Buddha, he sent missionaries out in various directions. And also around the time of Ashoka, you had like a lot of Buddhists kind of moving into like what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it was largely through Central Asia converting to Buddhism that it finally got into China, north of the Himalayas. So um, I think Advaita Vedanta may have played some role in Buddhism spreading outside of India, but I think it was not very significant. I think it would be a very minor contribution. And I'm still blurry. How do I stop being blurry? How do I do this? You're just gonna have to deal with blurry. Just knit or something while you listen to this. So the next question is from Arain. And Arain says, what is the Dharma of the Little Prince? So the Little Prince is, probably most of you are aware, is like a little illustrated story, almost like an art book by some French person whose name I can't pronounce. And there is some kind of Dharma in it. But I have to kind of give a disclaimer here that I have not read the book in probably at least 35 years. So it's my memory of the Little Prince is kind of sketchy. I haven't seen any movie versions of it in about 35 years either. But I mean, there is some Dharma that comes to mind. Like there is a certain emphasis on the inevitability of death. I remember a long time ago, I was maybe 21 years old at the time, maybe 20. I was watching a claymation version of The Little Prince, and I actually got choked up, got tears in my eyes, in the scene where the snake that talks in riddles is telling the Little Prince that it's time for him to die. So, I mean, there's acceptance of death, death itself in The Little Prince. There's like the talk about the baobabs, how, you have to weed the baobabs before they turn into these huge trees, because then you can't do anything. I mean, that's a lot. There's Dhamma in that. There's a famous Burmese Sayadaw, Thitigu Sayadaw, who says that a person is like a tree, that if the tree is small and crooked, you can straighten it out. But once the tree gets big, you can't straighten it out anymore, which is similar to the whole story of the baobabs in The Little Prince. I think there's a lot of emphasis in The Little Prince of just following your own heart and your own conscience rather than just conforming. So if you follow your own heart and your own conscience, you're more likely to see the the elephant being swallowed by the python instead of a hat, like towards the beginning of the story. So I guess what I'm going to have to do is just read the book again, and then maybe I can give like a Buddhist critique of The Little Prince, because I mean, I'm not saying that The Little Prince is, as dharmic as, some Buddhist sutra or something, but, it's, to some degree, it's just really kind of a nice story. But there is some Dharma in it, and I'll have to read the book again in order to really get into details on that. So I'll just move on to the next question. After consuming a little more of these bovine glandular secretions. This question is from Ludovic Balam. And Ludovic Balam says, do you have any memories of your distinguishing personality traits at the ages of 2 to 4? If so, mind sharing? Well, my earliest memory, I think, is my 3rd birthday. So the whole third year of my life, between 2 and 3 is a blank. I don't remember anything from that time. I've got very few memories that go back that far. It's like the myelin sheaths of my neurons are not fully formed yet. And, my long-term memory wasn't fully hooked up. But I do know some stories of when I was really little that do kind of indicate what I was going to turn into. Like one story that my father used to like to tell is, I don't remember this personally, but he used to tell the story of when I was like 2 years old. And my mother was making biscuits for dinner. She had the biscuits out on this cookie sheet, and then she remembered she needed something, so she had to run to the store to get some ingredient for dinner. She asks my father, who's drinking a beer watching TV in the living room, keep an eye on the kid, which he said okay, and then just continues drinking the beer and watching the TV. And I toddle, little 2-year-old me toddles into the living room and starts saying, turtles in the water, turtles in the water. And my father didn't understand what I was talking about. You know, he didn't care. He's just drinking the beer and watching TV. Finally, my mother comes home, goes into the kitchen, and sees that I climbed up on a chair and took some of the raw biscuits off the cookie sheet and put them in the dog's water, and was calling them turtles in the water. So, I mean, I was just had like this weird sense of humor ever since I was like 2 years old. I remember one time when I was like 4, my brother was still an infant baby, and I remember I had this big stuffed monkey or a chimpanzee, or it was like a big stuffed primate of some sort, and I put that in my bed, and then I climbed underneath my brother's crib and was like lying on the floor there. So then when my mother came in, she thought that the large stuffed monkey was me until she, you know, bent over to kiss it goodnight and realized it wasn't me, and then looked around and saw me hiding under the crib of my brother. So, I mean, I was kind of a nonconformist, you know, just sort of bucking the tide, even as a small child. And I had like a offbeat sense of humor, even as a toddler, apparently. I mean, I would specialize in telling nursery rhymes wrong. I don't know if little kids even tell nursery rhymes anymore. Like when you're 3 or 4 years old, you know, you get taught to recite like Humpty Dumpty and, you know, Hickory Dickory Dock and all that kind of stuff. I would say them wrong on purpose. So the only other distinguishing personality trait, I mean, I don't know if this would even count, but it's one of my earliest memories. I remember my father had a motorcycle and he was trying to teach my mother how to ride a motorcycle. And we were in the backyard, and the only thing she could possibly hit would be my swing set. And of course, she gets on the motorcycle, makes a beeline straight for the swing set, just smashes into it and she and the motorcycle fall over. And I remember running up to her, and her leg was bleeding. You know, she cut her leg somehow. And for me, I started crying. You know, I was a little kid at the time. And because, you know, up to that point, little kids, you know, they just assume that adults don't get hurt or bleed or something. You know, it's like they're like the gods. And, you know, little kids obviously get hurt, but I mean, your parents aren't supposed to get hurt. So, I mean, that kind of scared me, but I don't know if that would be a distinguishing personality trait. That was just sort of like an insight that even adults can get messed up and have, you know, accidents and injuries and so forth. But yeah, the weird sense of humor and the sort of nonconformism has been a distinguishing personality trait of mine since I was a toddler. So I'll just move on to Ludovic Balam's next question. If you had to pick between one of the mystery cults of ancient Greece, which would you pick? Well, I'm no authority on ancient Greek mystery cults, but what little I know, I suppose I'd join Orphism. I'd be an Orphist. Is that what they're called? I would, yeah, I'd be a member of the Orphic mysteries. They believed in like reincarnation and so forth, I'm pretty sure. Um, I don't know, maybe a Pythagorean? Is it, well, but the Pythagoreans, I don't know if you'd even call that a mystery cult. So let's just go with Orphism. Unless I was sort of like a social climber, and then maybe I'd go for the Eleusinian mysteries because it was like all the aristocrats would join that one. Sort of like being a Freemason or something. But let's just say Orphism for now. So the next question is from the Arya Sawasti Project. And the Arya Sawasti Project says, Hi Panyo, recently Ajahn Punadamo was giving a talk on metta mediation. This is one of the most common typos that Buddhists make, is spelling meditation as mediation because it doesn't get the red underline because it's another word, so you don't notice. I'll just start over. Hi Panyo, recently Ajahn Punadama was giving a talk on metta meditation and broadcasting metta to others. I see how this can benefit the meditator, but do you suppose the recipients of the broadcasted metta benefit from it? And do you suppose it changes their experience during the meditation mediation as well? On the flip side of this topic, can someone feel the effects of ill will from others? And lastly, if one has enough metta at all times, would that buffer them from ill will from others, supposing it could be felt? Well, yeah, I think that if you're just gushing love or beaming love, like sincere love towards another person, they're going to pick up on it, unless maybe they're just a complete sociopath and cut off from like the deeper intuitive levels. But I do remember my preceptor, Venerable Flying Thanissaro, he didn't like me much. He thought that Westerners were just like wild barbarians, that we weren't Burmese enough to be really good Buddhist people. And he just didn't like me very much. And but then one day, I was just feeling like this warm feeling in my chest, and like it was like I just felt really good. I didn't know why. And then it turned out that at that exact time that Thanissaro was leading metta meditation in the shrine room in the main building of the monastery, and probably just beaming love in all directions. And I sincerely think I picked up on some of that. And yeah, there is like a deeper level where we're all kind of connected, or at least we're receptive and sensitive to other people's feelings. I mean, all it takes is somebody who's just beaming love and benevolence sitting on a bus, and it's going to have effects on the people around him, even if he's not doing anything. He might just be minding his own business, looking out the window or something. Still, people are going to pick up on that. And likewise, you can have someone who's just in this black mood, he's just wanting to kill everybody, and he doesn't have to say or do anything. He can just sit there, and it's going to have like an effect on the people around him. That mental states are contagious, which is why in the Mangala Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, which is the list of 38 blessings, blessing number 1 is avoiding the company of fools, not associating with fools. Because mental states are contagious. If you associate with fools, their foolishness is going to rub off on you. And if you associate with the wise, which is the second blessing, then their wisdom and goodness is going to rub off on you. It's going to influence your mind. There is there is some truth to the mob mentality, and it goes both ways. It can be good or bad. So let's see. Yeah, I do think that. I mean, there are lots of stories of. There was lots of stories of like a Buddhist person in Burma, and like their boss is just giving them a hard time, just doesn't like them, is being mean to them, asshole-ish. And so the person who is the recipient of this assholishness from the boss goes to some wise sayadaw, some wise monk, and he'll give them instructions on how to do metta meditation towards the boss. And I remember one case where within just like a week or two, the boss just had a sudden change of heart and called the person into his office and sincerely apologized. I realize now that I've been treating you badly, and I am sorry, this kind of thing. There's lots of stories of that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think anyone with any sensitivity can know that mental states really are contagious. You don't have to do anything like overtly, outwardly, to really influence the mind of another person. So let's see, can someone feel the effects of ill will from others? Yeah, I mean, if someone's just pissed off, and I mean, just to give an obvious example, you're in the same room with someone who's just really upset. I mean, it's the whole atmosphere is gonna be like lead. It's just you just pick up on it. Now, even animals can pick up on this kind of thing. Like my father used to say, sneaking up on a moose is almost impossible. If you're moose hunting, trying to sneak up on the moose, almost impossible. The moose will always get spooked and run off. But if you sneak up on the tree next to the moose, it's as easy as hunting cows, because we just have this, like a sixth sense, I guess. We can pick up on that kind of thing. Okay, so let's see. Lastly, if one has enough metta at all times, would that buffer them from ill will from others? Yeah, if you've got metta at all times, you're going to have good karma. Not only will it buffer you if someone's trying to mess you up, but people will just be less likely to want to mess you up. That you're just a good guy. I mean, it's like if you're full of love towards everybody, there aren't very many people that are really going to want to mess with you. And furthermore, I mean, that's just like at a kind of a superficial worldly level, but at the more metaphysical level, you're just generating such good karma. You're creating a better world that you're living in, where it's just less likely that bad stuff is going to happen to you. And I keep kind of glancing out the window because there's a storm moving in. So I think I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Pseudonym. And as I keep saying, I doubt that that's his real name. And Pseudonym says, can you please provide a steelman argument for the spiritual benefits one gains from the Abhidhamma? And I asked him what a steelman argument is. And he said it's like the opposite of a straw man, where you're making as strong of a case as possible, even though you don't really necessarily believe it to be true, which is kind of like sophistry, I guess. So can I please provide a sophisticated, what's the word? Sophical argument for the spiritual benefits one gains from Abhidhamma? Well, it's an intellectual exercise. You do learn a lot of Buddhist philosophy. In a way, it can be sort of like reading the New Testament of the Bible, where at least you're knowing what you're rejecting. So, I mean, there is that. I mean, it is good for any kind of literate, knowledgeable, educated Theravada Buddhist to know what Abhidhamma is about, because he should know what the orthodox party line of his system is saying, even if he's not following it, even if he doesn't think that the Buddha really taught Abhidhamma. And I think most Westerners don't believe that the Buddha really taught Abhidhamma. With regard to Western monks, I've seen the number kicked around. Maybe 70% of Western monks do not believe that the Buddha really taught Abhidhamma. But it's sort of like a way of systematizing Dhamma, where you've got all these lists and classifications and so forth. So it can help you to understand philosophically, intellectually, certain aspects of like older, more traditional Dhamma. Plus, it's just an intellectual exercise. It can help stave off early onset dementia, I guess. And again, one of the main benefits of Abhidhamma is at least you're literate and knowledgeable in Theravada and Orthodoxy, so that even if you reject Abhidhamma, at least you have a good idea of what it is you're rejecting. So I'll just move on to the next question, and this is from, I'm pretty sure it's from Yuichiro, but his name is spelled in Japanese characters, so I'm pretty sure it's Yuichiro. And Yuichiro, I think, says, hypothetically, if someone resolved to do more good things in the future, but out of the selfish desire for karmic rewards, would the net karma of this still be positive? Yeah, it depends on the individual. But as a general rule, if you're doing something good and you're just doing it because you want to get into heaven, that's pretty common theme in Western religions also, like Christianity and Islam, for example. You're going for those heavenly virgins or something, or you're just trying to stay out of hellfire. Still, I mean, you're doing good things. You're increasing happiness, decreasing misery, among the beings around you. So, I mean, you're still doing good, but the Burmese are really susceptible to this. I mean, they're very devout Buddhists. Burma may be the most thoroughly Buddhist country in the world, and the people there tend to be spiritual materialists. They're wanting merit. They want kudo. They call it in Burmese. It's the Burmese way of saying kusala. Like kusala kama. Wholesome action. They want kudo. They want merit, and so they can be really proud about the good deeds that they do. They donate a meditation cabin to a monastery. They'll have a big sign over the meditation cabin. This meditation cabin donated by, such and such and such and such, and their family members are all there. And I remember once my teacher, Venerable Tongpulu Chalsendoya Seattle, gave a Dhamma talk about if you really want the most merit, then you should do it, good deeds, without the desire for merit, which is, in a way, it was kind of like fucking up the minds of the audience. It's like, I want to get the most merit possible, so I'm going to have to do this without desiring merit. And so that's what I'm going to do. And it's just like self-contradictory. because they're obviously trying to maximize the amount of good karma that they get. So they're, it's spiritual materialists. It's like anyone who has read Burmese Days by George Orwell. George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm in 1984, he lived in Burma during colonial times. He was some sort of police officer in central Burma. And one of his earlier novels was called Burmese Days, about what it was like for British colonialists living in Burma. And the main villain of the story is U Po Chin. He's just really just this bad man, Burmese guy. And his wife is continually scolding him in her demure, passive, Burmese ladylike way, telling him he's an evil man, he's going to go to hell. And he's saying, "Oh, you don't know anything. I'm going to build a pagoda." Because the Burmese think that if you donate a pagoda, you have a pagoda built. I mean, that's like guarantee heaven right there. You've made so much merit. It's just the stairway to heaven right there. But unfortunately for U Po Chin, he had a stroke before he ever got the time to build the pagoda, so he was pretty much screwed. So, yeah, I mean, if you do good deeds out of the selfish desire for karmic rewards, I mean, you're still going to get the karmic rewards, just not as good of karmic rewards as if you just do something out of just the goodness of your heart, just irrespective of any desire for benefit. Like the Burmese spiritual materialists that they are, bless their hearts. I don't want to badmouth them, but I used to tell them. I mean, as a young monk in Burma, I'd have these little debates, friendly, polite debates with the local village doctor who spoke English, and saying, I mean, it's better to feed a hungry child or even a hungry dog than just set an extra plate of food on a plate on the table before like an obese monk who's already got 10 times as much food as he can possibly eat. I mean, that's the way the Burmese are. You got some famous Sayadaw. He's got the reputation for being a saint or a sage. And at lunchtime, he's got this huge, I mean, I used to have this sometimes too, this whole table covered with like 20 different dishes of food. And there's no way he could eat 10% of that. But still people are wanting to somehow fit more food onto the table. And he doesn't need it. On the other hand, there might be like a hungry kid down the road. I mean, skinny, dirty, poor. I mean, the little kid never gets to eat food that good. And probably, I mean, if you do it just out of the goodness of your heart, you'd make more merit anyway, because you're motivated not by greed for merit. You're doing it out of like compassion and benevolence. I mean, you just want to do good just for its own sake, or it makes you happy to see some hungry being getting a full belly for once. I mean, even for me, I'd be happier feeding some scroungy, mangy dog than putting just another plate of food on this table for some famous monk. In general, I mean, there might be exceptions. I might not like the dog very much, and it may be that, the monk really, you just have a lot of respect and gratitude towards this teacher, and you want to make some little contribution to him in the hopes that maybe he'll have at least one taste of what you put there. So yeah, this is another one of my trademark long answers to short questions. Let's see here. So I'll just read the question again just to make sure. Hypothetically, if someone resolved to do more good things in the future, but out of the selfish desire for karmic rewards, would the net karma of this still be positive? Yeah, it would still be more positive than negative, unless you really had some really awful mental states accompanying the outwardly good act. And it's just a sliding scale. I mean, like I keep saying over and over again, it's like the action itself is not really what makes the karma. The outward physical action, it may like magnify or intensify the karma because you're really just going through with it. You're not just kind of fantasizing about it. You're just really, you've crossed the line. You're doing it. So, I mean, it sort of intensifies your karma, but really it's the mental states that determine the karmic quality of your actions. And just desire for heaven or desire for a good rebirth, that is not evil in and of itself. in a way, it kind of makes the good act a little less karmically pure, but still you're doing good. And I mean, you're not harming anybody, except for maybe in very subtle, indirect ways yourself, but you're doing more good than bad. And so finally, the very last question. This is from Achala. I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's almost like a tradition that people who ask questions have difficult names to pronounce. So Achala says, or Acala, he says, do you think whatever we are going through today has happened in the past at some point, like many kalpas ago? Since samsara has no beginning point, it would be absurd to accept that whatever we are experiencing in the society today is happening for the first time, like rise of AI, COVID, or any other invention. In the Chakravati Sutta, Buddha describes the rise and fall of a society, so we can think it's a cycle that repeats in samsara. Yeah, but it's not just temporal distance. I mean, we're not living in a four-dimensional universe. It's not just three dimensions of space plus time. It's not Newtonian that in all likelihood, we're living in many worlds. There's an infinite number of versions of reality. However many versions are possible are there, and they're all pretty much superimposed. So it's not just, every possible world has happened and will continue happening in the scientific astronomical universe, that you've got other dimensions, other probabilities. You move sideways through time and you get into other probabilities where, the Nazis won World War II or something, or whatever. So I really do think that all possible realities, all possible samsaric realities, I mean, they're already here. I mean, if not in our version of reality, in some other version, which is just as real or unreal as this. So with regard to, let's say, other human societies with the rise of artificial intelligence, transhumanism, the technological singularity, it's happened an infinite number of times. It's happening an infinite number of times now. It's going to happen an infinite number of times in the future. Anything that can possibly happen in an infinite universe is going to happen. It just keeps happening. So I really don't limit myself to four dimensions. But even with four dimensions, sure, I mean, out there in space, in some other galaxy, you've got, some Star Trek kind of universe with people speaking English with an American accent who, they're just slight differences or more major differences. So sure, let's see, I got to read this question over again just to make sure I get it right, or at least that I understand the question, not necessarily that I'll answer it correctly. Do you think whatever we are going through today has happened in the past at some point, like many kalpas ago? Yeah, or sideways in time or whatever. Since samsara has no beginning point, it would be absurd to accept that whatever we are experiencing in the society today is happening for the first time, like the rise of AI, COVID, or any other invention. Okay, yeah, so it's, like I think it's the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament says there's nothing new under the sun. Now there's obviously new things under our sun. I don't think there's ever been cell phones or silicon chips on this planet with our sun. But I mean, it's probably happened infinite number of times and will continue to happen an infinite number of times, just in other versions of reality, other worlds, whatever. So yeah, it's a lot of people are just kind of limited in their thinking just because they just assume that the scientific materialistic universe pretty well describes reality, and I don't think I mean, it describes what we are in right now, our version of reality pretty well, but there's like an infinite number of versions, all equally real or unreal. And yeah, I mean, it's not ultimately real anyway. So that's it. I did it in only less than 2 hours and 10 minutes. So that's not bad. I am kind of time conscious. I don't want to subject people to 3-hour long videos, because I rarely would sit through a 3-hour long video myself. So there you go. I hope I did justice to your questions. I'm sorry for the delay. I probably should have done this last weekend, but just didn't have the time. And feel free to ask questions. You get at least 6 questions. If there's a dearth of questions, we may even go more than 6, but I promise I'll answer at least 6. And feel free to leave your questions below in the comments, or if you have access to my Subscribe Star, you can leave them there. You have access to the Discord server, you can leave them there. You're very welcome to subscribe to my channel on BitChute or YouTube, and leave a like if you're so inclined, and be happy.